Slavery is unfortunately still with us. According to Anti-Slavery International, it impacts around 50 million people worldwide. So, why are so many people still not free? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the number of victims of modern slavery has been rising year on year, with an estimated 130,000 people affected in the UK alone. Women and children remain the most vulnerable to exploitation and forced labour. So, will slavery ever be eradicated?
Modern slavery is widespread and no country seems to be free of it. According to the Global Slavery Index compiled by Walk Free, a human rights group, modern slavery is most prevalent in Asia and the Pacific, followed by Africa. Modern slavery is often hidden in plain sight because it takes many forms. Vulnerable people find themselves being tricked or coerced into works that deprives them of their freedom. Criminal organizations exploit individuals for personal or commercial gain.
The people that may clean your homes, the people that work in hotels, the guys that make your favorite curry on a Friday night, the people that paint your nails, the people that wash your cars. I'm not saying that all of them are going to be forced against their will to do this, and nor am I saying that all of them will be slaves. But what I am saying is that slavery has been identified in each of those sectors right here in the UK.
Slavery is a lucrative business and victims are treated as commodities. According to the International Labour Organization, slavery generates as much as $150 billion in profits globally every year, more than 1/3 of which is generated in developed countries, including the EU. The UK's hostile environment legislation has meant people trafficked from abroad are often treated as immigration offenders rather than vulnerable victims in need of support. Is there enough will from governments, corporations and consumers to end slavery for good?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining us from Liverpool in the UK is Alex Balch. He is a professor of politics at the University of Liverpool and the Director of Research at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre. I'm delighted to say with me in the studio is Sophie Otiende. She's an activist and the founder of Azadi. That's a survivor-led initiative in Kenya which offers long-term support for the survivors of trafficking. And Grace Forrest is the founding director of Walk Free, an international human rights organisation working to eradicate modern slavery. Grace and Sophie are commissioners for the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. Grace, I'll come to you first. I spent some time recently in Ireland with senior law enforcement officers from Ireland, the UK, the United States, and one phrase that kept coming up on this was hidden in plain sight. The general public don't have a clue. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think the general public don't have a clue about the prevalence of modern slavery in the world today and the prevalence of modern slavery on their doorstep. You know, we produce something at Walk Free called the Global Slavery Index. It's the world's leading data set on measuring and understanding modern slavery. And in the last 5 years, we've seen a 10 million person increase in the number of people living in modern slavery globally, bringing the number to 50 million people worldwide. And this data set is measuring modern slavery across 160 countries. We're looking at over 100,000 people experiencing modern slavery right here in the United Kingdom. We're looking at countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, their figures having doubled in the last 5 years. We have 3 G20 countries in the top 10 worst offenders of modern slavery. So hidden in plain sight is maybe even an understatement, because modern slavery could literally be as close as the shirt on your back, the coffee you drank this morning, the food you see in the supermarket, and people living in plain sight in your communities.
Sophie, what's driving this? These numbers are extraordinary.
Yeah, the numbers are extraordinary, but also what I like to say is the numbers actually represent people. So even as we talk about the numbers, we really need to think that these are real people, right? And as soon as you start talking about people, you start thinking about what actually causes vulnerability in people. And modern slavery doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to any other human rights abuse that you've seen out there. So whether you are talking about the number of people where this issue occurs, the people it impacts are basically the same people who are affected by different issues. Whether you're talking about climate change, you're talking about war, whether you're talking about gender-based violence, it's the same groups of people who we see being affected by these things are the ones being affected by modern slavery.
Alex, I just want to bring you in on those numbers. I think people will be shocked to know that there are 160,000 victims of modern slavery in the United Kingdom right now.
Yeah, they would be shocked, and rightly so. But I mean, that is an estimate, and we could get into the methods about how these estimates are generated. As with Sophie, I think the numbers are important, but we do have to remember that one person in the situation of severe exploitation is too many. So while it's really important to work on the prevalence methods and improve our understanding of estimates, those are useful tools for policymakers. We have to think about, returning to your question about hidden in plain sight, what is allowing this to be hidden in plain sight? What is enabling it to be hidden in plain sight? And why aren't politicians taking it seriously enough to actually make a difference? So I think the fact that it's hidden in plain sight suggests that it's entrenched, it's embedded. It reflects long-standing inequalities, power dynamics, which allow exploitation to happen. Those are really political questions. So instead of thinking perhaps about the general public's awareness, I think we should be thinking about the seriousness with which politicians are taking this issue.
Grace, just educate us here. What kind of industries, where should people be looking in countries like the UK? Because when you speak to people here, modern slavery is not a talking point, and people would say Britain is a very first world country, advanced and modern, and yet it has archaic practices hidden.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to echo your point as well, Alex, because it couldn't be more true that we're talking about structural inequality. Exploitation, as Sophie said, it never happens in a vacuum. And when we talk about modern slavery, it would be remiss not to think about historical slavery, because the same industries of historical slavery persist as industries of high exploitation today. That is not an accident. Cotton, tobacco, gold, rare earths, all of these industries, they beg the question, did these wealthy, quote-unquote, democratic countries fix these problems, or did they simply outsource them? So in the UK, industries that come up quite often are agricultural, people working in nail salons, people working in the care economy, people working in car washing industries. But I think a theme that I'd like to draw us out from that came through very much through the numbers, which are built from interviewing survivors of slavery throughout the world, is that migrant workers are 3 times more likely to experience modern slavery than non-migrant workers. And that story is true from Saudi Arabia to the United Kingdom. The G20 countries alone, just 20 countries, are responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars of import risk each year of goods at very high risk of being made using forced and child labour. Those industries are garments, they're solar panels, they're textiles, palm oil, products that are in things that we come into contact with every single day.
So we're supporting this by our consumer choices.
I would say that modern slavery and exploitation are strong drivers of our modern economy.
Sophie, the numbers on the financial side are truly extraordinary. This is a very lucrative business for organised crime in particular. They are taking human beings, abusing them, taking them to other countries where they possibly can't even speak the language, and they are exploiting these people for significant sums of cash.
That is true. I think one of the reasons why also the issue is a bit, as you're saying, hidden in plain sight is also because of how it's defined, right? And how people understand it. While, yes, it is organized crime, it's also part of what Grace has pointed out. It's some of the choices we are making in terms of how we want to live our lives, how we want to produce the food we want to eat. So it's embedded in the system. So I think the organized crime is a bit easy to point out because it's easy to say, this is the enemy, these are the people we need to arrest. But when you think about, for example, a story like mine, where my abuse happened in the context of family, we can't arrest all family members who decide they want to abuse other family members, right? And we have so many forms of modern slavery that are not organized crime. And those are some of the ones that, as you are saying, are hidden in plain sight because people are not willing to think of what the solution is if it's really my fault somehow that somebody else is suffering.
Sophie, one thing that police officers said to me recently in Ireland on this topic was that the public, if they have suspicions, they then afterwards, when the story hits the media and it gets a lot of coverage, the reaction from the public is, well, if it was so bad, why didn't they run away? I mean, there is a lot of ignorance out there, isn't there?
Yes, and that's why I'm saying it's a human rights issue. People are making rational decisions because of structural inequality. A migrant woman is making a decision, a rational decision, to come to our country to work so that they can take care of their family. We will never blame anybody for wanting a good life for their children. Every single person out there wants that. But then someone takes advantage of that, takes advantage of the fact that they can't speak a language, takes advantage of the fact that they can't be able to, navigate the system in which they exist in at that particular moment, and then abuse them. So even when we think about, and we things like just decent, advocating for decent and dignified work for everyone, regardless of whether you're a migrant worker or where you come from, is a simple thing that all of us can agree that, people should have decent and dignified work.
Alex, talk to me about policing and education levels amongst police officers. There was an incident in Ireland last year where a Vietnamese man was arrested in a very rural area and he had been cultivating cannabis plants on an industrial scale. The police officers from An Garda Síochána, the Irish police force, when they initially turned up, they thought he was part of some big drugs gang. And then upon closer investigation, he didn't even know he was in Ireland. He couldn't speak the language and he had been trafficked in and was being treated in appalling conditions. And he was basically being put to work for this drugs gang. Ultimately, he was released from the investigation. But do you think more police officers and law enforcement need specific training on this to be able to spot it when they see it?
Yes, definitely. And there's lots of evidence of sort of poor levels of knowledge amongst what we call first responders. Obviously, pockets of good practice, but I think, it's difficult to cover all the different types of circumstances. I mean, the one you mentioned there is one that's quite common in the UK, where you have a criminal activity, which is, by definition going to have to be hidden. You often use people who are in a vulnerable situation, like migrants, to do the work. That's one type of modern slavery, but we have others that are maybe a bit more like Sophie's explaining, tied to the way that the immigration system works more generally. So we have lots of problems in the UK around seasonal agricultural workers. And now increasingly we're hearing social and health care workers are being exploited because of the way their visas are tied to an employer. Which renders them, vulnerable to exploitation. So there's different types of situation. I would argue there you need better labour inspection, better labour rights. You need, enforcement agencies other than the police getting involved. But of course, you need the police as well. What we're seeing is, a complex and widespread phenomenon. Therefore, we need, a sort of variegated and complex response where different agencies step up. So it is the police, but it's not just the police. I don't think we should just point the finger there, because this is not necessarily all about criminal activities. It might be in the normal economy, as so to speak, where exploitation is happening. So in that case, you need to look at the general labour market conditions, the visa conditions that many hundreds of thousands of workers are living under. And, I was in a conference in Ireland as well a few weeks ago, different one to you, I think. And there's a straightforward correlation between the number of visas issued and the levels of exploitation being experienced in the labour market. So we do have to look carefully at the systems and how they're designed.
Grace, we're seeing a lot of conflict around the world and climate change as well. Talk to us about the impact those factors are having. I mean, millions and millions more people on the move, and they're vulnerable to exploitation.
Absolutely. I think probably the most important point to make is that modern slavery never happens in a vacuum, and the world's most vulnerable people are hit hardest and fastest every time by these global shocks that we've been experiencing. So this 10 million person increase in the last 5 years, it is due to compounding crises. And it is due to the fact that, today we're living in an age with 56 active conflicts. That's more than any other time since World War II. We're living at a time of distress migration due to these conflicts, as well as due to climate volatility and crises. And I think that the difficult thing is that too often policymakers are seeing an issue like modern slavery as something that is, dare I say, niche, even though it's impacting tens of millions of people. And these numbers, these people, these are conservative estimates. We're not able to properly measure in war zones. We're not able to properly measure inside totalitarian states. And still, the numbers are staggering. So we really do need climate solutions to be focused on the fact that a climate crisis is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis. And right now, the solutions we're seeing to the climate crisis, this green transition, they are inherently built on supply chains that are going to be and are exploitative and deeply extractive. So we know that so much of the world's polysilica, a core ingredient going into solar panels in the world throughout, is coming out of Xinjiang Autonomous Region, where we know there is egregious forms of human rights abuses, including state-imposed forced labour. And we need countries like the G7, like the G20, to say that we care about this, because in 2024, we need leaders to be able to walk and chew gum. You can't harm people in the name of saving the planet.
Sophie, you work with survivors, you are a survivor. What's the human impact of modern slavery when so much has been taken from people, from you?
I think trauma is definitely the highest impact. And when you think about some of the solutions that people envision for survivors, we really don't think about wholesome solutions, right? Because most of the time, as soon as people think, again, Grace mentioned it, people think that modern slavery is so niche. So therefore, as soon as survivors come out and say, you find a survivor, there's a tendency to really paternalize them, especially during the first maybe 3-4 months of it. But what the data shows is that trauma affects survivors for years. More than 20 years into their recovery, they still haven't recovered, depending on the form of exploitation that they've gone through. So we are not just talking about, simple things. We are talking about someone's life radically being changed as a result of the abuse that they've gone through. Again, referring to myself as someone who's gone through this, I've been impacted. My mental health has been impacted. My physical health has been impacted. Some of the choices that I've had to make career-wise have been correlated specifically to the trauma that I faced. Nobody should have to face that kind of shift in their lives simply as a result of trauma. And therefore, that's why advocating for proper services, one, to prevent survivors from even becoming survivors in the first place. So for me, social protection is key. Because we've spoken about vulnerability. For me, it's quite simple. If things like education, healthcare, and all these are things that all of us can be able to enjoy, if they were guaranteed, would be able to reduce some of the vulnerabilities that we are seeing. And in addition, when survivors come back into communities, they would have a safety net. So the impact is significant, and we need to build a robust system that actually caters for trauma that has affected survivors.
Grace, I want to ask you, you work closely with Sophie and she does incredible work on this. How important is it that Sophie's voice is heard and that her story is told and that people listen to someone who's actually been through it?
Well, I'm incredibly privileged to have been working with and learning from Sophie for many years. And frankly, any solution to modern slavery that's done without people with lived experience, it won't work. Fundamental to any solution that we're tackling, especially on intersectional issues of justice and human rights, communities and individuals that are closest to the issues are also closest to the solutions. And for too long, we've had a whitewashed approach to tackling something in bits and pieces and not in the systemic way that it needs to be tackled. So all research, all frontline programs, all policy decisions, all these, if you're in a room where decisions are being made without someone with lived experience, I guarantee you it's going to fail. So it is absolutely fundamental to the work of Walk Free, and it's fundamental to the success of the modern slavery movement that it's not just partnered by, but led by experts, and experts as people who have had lived experience.
Alex, there is a new government now in the United Kingdom. Keir Starmer is British Prime Minister. Modern slavery was not mentioned in 6 weeks of election campaigning, and the general public, I would say, hand on heart, don't really understand it. What would you like to see policy-wise from this new British government?
Well, we've been conducting a lot of research at the Modern Slavery PEC, looking at sort of how to move to a more preventative approach. Obviously, modern slavery is a red flag that something's gone very badly wrong, and obviously we need to help those people affected. But really, a prevention strategy should be trying to stop it happening in the first place, and a prevention strategy is absent in the UK. The previous government, while talking a lot about modern slavery, never developed a prevention strategy. So I would hope that the new government would take an approach that's more system-wide. I'd like to see the involvement of people directly affected, as the other guests have said. That's actually easier said than done because, working with the Home Office, social services, these are institutions that have caused harm over the years and are difficult for marginalized communities to trust. So we need to build trust. We need to rebuild a lot of trust that was lost, particularly in the last few years with the Conservative government's sort of attack on people claiming they were or being identified as victims of modern slavery, claiming that they were somehow abusing the system. That's lost a lot of trust. Also, some of the really hostile environment policies of the previous government, that's also eroded a lot of trust and created more harm. So there's a long list of things that the new government could do better, starting with a prevention approach, maybe a slightly more enhanced view of workers' rights, labour rights, inspection, but also just building that trust in the institutions that are going to be needed to build a more safe and resilient system for people. So that's a really long wish list, but I do think there will be benefits if that's the approach that's taken.
Grace, just come in on the trust issue there, if you would, please.
Oh, yeah, trust has definitely been corroded, and that's not unique to the United Kingdom. We're living this year in a fascinating time. There's many elections happening throughout the world in every region, and we really want human rights to be on the agenda, and they are on the agenda for young people. Look what happened with the independents, with the Greens. People care about these issues. They're not niche issues, and I would just add to that wish list, which I think is a brilliant one, that I think that the current legislation that we have, the Modern Slavery Act, while, conceptually good 10 years ago, we know it's not working. We know that we need this transparency to go well beyond transparency and into due diligence. We need human rights due diligence laws and the international standards that have been brought in through the EU, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Bit of a mouthful, but this is the new international standard we need to work towards to make sure that businesses aren't just accidentally stumbling upon harm and then reacting to it and probably cutting off that supplier and harming people further, but actually proactively looking realistically at the industry level risk that they all face and then showing us what they're doing to engage with workers, to ensure they're protected, and frankly, to make sure that we're not having to buy products every day that is robbing another human being of their most basic human rights.
Sophie, how much responsibility then is there on business leaders, CEOs, business owners to make sure that, if they're profiting from when companies do well and things are going very well, that they need to be aware of their supply chains, their employees and their work practices?
I think it's extremely important. Any CEO who wants to run a business in this environment, and as Grace has said, everyone wants to buy products that they know at the end of the day are not, somebody else has not been abused. I think we should be able to control the market just by saying that, we hold CEOs accountable. But beyond that, if they are not accountable, the system has the ability to hold them accountable. I think right now the biggest problem is people have the ability to say whatever they want to say in terms of going back to the issue of trust. Many of these organizations, many of the businesses that are abusing people basically know how to navigate the system to tick the box. So for me, the biggest issue is a system that can hold people accountability, and it's not dependent on the goodwill of someone. So I should, as a worker, it shouldn't matter whether Grace or Alex is the CEO. I should be able to experience the same kind of conditions whether Grace or Alex is CEO. And for me, that makes the buck stop mainly at government and at policy level, and at ensuring that accountability is done consistently so that we are not dependent on individuals.
Thanks, Sophie. Alex, final point really, how much emphasis should there be on the public, the eyes and ears? Everyone's out there, people use car washes, nail bars, all these other businesses. do you think the public need to start asking more questions, that if they see something or if they have a suspicion, that they immediately just think, you know what, I wouldn't mind ringing the police about that?
I don't think there's any harm in that, and I do think we have to, try and hold businesses to account. But is it really going to be the general public that holds businesses to account? As Sophie says, they can find ways around. The supply chains can be complex, and they can even claim they don't know what's in their supply chains. I think we do have to basically bring in the government here, because the government can produce the fair level playing field that forces businesses to behave properly. I think even businesses would prefer that, because at the moment they're dealing with a range of different types of legislation. We have forced labor import bans from the US. We have the due diligence coming in the EU. We have transparency in the UK. These are all requirements on business that are actually a little bit different. And if the businesses can't even navigate them, God help the consumer, who's supposed to understand all these fair trade criteria that are really quite opaque. I do think we have to return to the government, and the government needs to work together internationally to make sure we get a level playing field. That's really difficult, but I do think that's the only effective way. All this soft law is likely to be, around the edges and not really deal with the core issue.
Alex, Grace and Sophie, thank you all so much for your insight. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.